Hi everyone, if you like this channel, please subscribe. It really helps the channel to grow and to thrive, plus it's completely free. Thank you. So the topic today is progressions and the comparison between Kamala's progressions and Trump's progressions. Progressions are reflecting the movement of the planets in the days after a person's birth. Those days turn into years in the projection, and they're remarkably accurate and remarkably reflective of what happens. And when you do that, when you look days down, first level of analysis is to take those positions and point them back to the original positions. What does that tell you? And the next step is to look at the progress chart all by itself, because it will also frequently reflect the situation in a particularly striking way. And so when I look at the progressions for Trump, you notice this very thing, which is that he's born with Leo rising, then progresses into Virgo, takes quite a few days, which means that until the 1980s, he had Virgo rising, then it switched to Libra. And he was in that Libra ascendant from the late 80s all the way until August of 2023. This was why, in months prior to that, I said quite a number of times, August is going to be a very challenging month for him. And the reason I was reading it that way is because once the ascendant switched from Libra to Scorpio, by looking at just the progress chart and the signal that it's sending, you see that it's very problematic. In fact, quite ominous, because what that did is it switched Libra, where all his progress planets were. He had a cluster of planets, all in Libra. In fact, Jupiter in progression joined to the progressed ascendant was one of the key reasons this guy was elected at all in 2016. But then, of course, progressions keep moving. By the time you reach August of 23, those planets, instead of being in the first sign, they become part of the 12th sign. And this is where you get in trouble if you've committed crimes, which the man has, despite the constant drumbeat, stating, I'm being persecuted unfairly, this is all a hoax. No, it is not. No, it is not at all a hoax. It's completely true. And this is where it's the way he uses the 12th sign, because the 12th sign has a range of operation, and planets in there can be very spiritual, or at minimum they could be involved in such things as social justice or charitable work. It's not what this guy does. Indeed, he created a charity with that house, but he was using the charity to put money in his own bank account. I mean, the man is a lifelong criminal. Now, he can blame his genetics. He can say, well, what can I do? My father was a KKK supporter, so this is the way I was born. Great, but it's still what he did with that energy. And so you reach August of 23, and what happens is he's charged, not once but twice, with, this was the Georgia and the Jack Smith indictments. Those are not going away. He can fight them all he likes. They're not going away, on the one hand, because that's the system of laws that we live under, and on the other, because the astrology says so. But in any case, there you have a very problematic ascendant switch. That ascendant is now going to be in Scorpio for the rest of his life. The other thing is, Scorpio in his chart is the bottom of the chart, which at this age often signifies the end. It's the end of the matter. It's one of the accepted views of the fourth sign. Indeed, this is what Biden found when Biden experienced transiting Saturn on that very bottom point on the IC of his chart. It meant that he had to stop. He had to pass the torch. So that's one thing. But we can keep looking, and we find other reflections that are as troubling or even more. probably the worst of these is that now, as he is seeking to be elected president a second time, his progressed Venus, now picture Venus, which originates in the 12th sign, which already kind of tells you, this could be a real problem. It may not work out well. Its progressed Venus starts out in Cancer. It's been moving, so that now is in Libra. Now, interestingly, when this progressed Venus was in earlier degrees a few years back, it was next to his Jupiter. That's really good. It saved him from a lot of trouble during his presidency, which is when it was. This is years back. But now it's moved forward, and right as he's running to be reelected, it's squaring Saturn in the 12th. That's a dead stop sign. Just like I mentioned yesterday in solar arcs, if solar arc Saturn is squaring Mercury, totally different thing, different measurement, but it just adds to this problem. So that progressed Venus square Saturn is a definite no. Absolute definite no. Then you notice that progressed Jupiter, which moves much more slowly, but it extends into later in the decade, squaring his Venus. Another square, another pointer at that planet in his 12th sign. None of that is good for winning an election. And the clincher becomes when you look at the progressed moon, because it's moving a lot more quickly, makes aspects more frequently, and one of them is unbelievably reflective of the way these aspects work as well as what was happening, so that right on cue, when Kamala Harris enters the scene in July, and then for approximately 2 months, which essentially is the beginning of her campaign that totally destabilized the Orange Menace, because he was expecting to run against Biden, etc., etc. That was the progressed moon doing an inconjunct, a 150. And what was it doing the 150 to? To Eris, which is perfect description of Kamala in his life, the warrioress, a female figure with a lot of power, is on the scene. And the 150 is a maladjusted, difficult energy that often shows up with health problems, injuries, and sometimes even death. Very complicated aspect. Now, as we go toward election night, what do you see? That progressed moon locks into a square to Pluto. And I can tell you from experience, progressed moon square Pluto never feels good. It's a problem progression. I've experienced it multiple times in my life. It's the way it feels. So on progressions, when it comes to Trump, it's a complete thumbs down. But of course now we have to compare to the progressions of Kamala Harris because he's running against her. So what's happening in her chart in terms of progressions? Well, what's interesting about Kamala is that she has experienced some really challenging progressions during the Biden-Harris administration, meaning in 2022, 2023. Ironically and interestingly, one of them was the very same thing that he's experiencing now. Progressed Venus was squaring her Saturn from mid-November 21 all the way to the summer of 23. And that was probably a hard time. It was. There were all kinds of things happening. Inflation was high. There were problems, definitely. And either way, you can surmise that it was difficult. But now she's beyond that. It's past, right? And when you look at her progressions as she goes into the election, they're remarkably smooth. Everything is sextile or trine, and I'm talking about the big planets and the moon as well. The moon is smooth as silk, sextile, trine, everything, going into the spring of next year. It's rock solid. And to add further proof, you look at a big progression, the progression of Jupiter. And when I say big, I mean in progressions, the slower the planet moves, the longer the progression will last, obviously, because it'll move a little bit each day, but that translates to years. Well, that Jupiter in her chart is progressing into a really key point, a really key area. She has a Venus-Pluto conjunction. It's just leaving the trine to Venus and then moving toward the trine to Pluto, which it never reaches, because what happens is years and years from now, because it's days from that point in progressions, it'll stop. It does a station. So essentially, it's going to trine that Venus-Pluto conjunction for the rest of her life. This is one of the reasons why I have tentatively, and now I'm saying more directly, that she's probably going to do 2 terms. It's not just about winning this election. This chart is really blessed in terms of the timing. Jupiter trining Venus-Pluto, she's a Libra, with Venus rules Libra. It's a really, really nice trine to enjoy for years and years and years. Remember that in her chart, Jupiter rules her zenith sign. It's the highest point in the chart, the 10th sign in a chart. Therefore, that Jupiter is very career related, very, very strong, and so that is going to help her a whole lot in terms of achieving her objectives. So the bottom line is, when you compare these two, there is no comparison. It's like night and day. It is so, so obvious. Right? So I'm amazed at some of these astrologers that claim to see things that tell them that Trump has any chance of winning this election. I just do not believe so. And of course, this is progressions. They're absolutely clear. You saw the solar arcs yesterday. You've seen plenty of transits as well. I'll keep talking about this because it's not just on one level, it's on multiple levels. The theme keeps repeating. Indeed, people often will ask me this question. They'll say, well, have you thought of this? Have you thought of that? That's my job. That's what I do. I constantly try to think of all the possible angles in situations, such as, for instance, people will say, well, what about January 20th? Because that's when inauguration happens. Here's an example where Kamala's progressions are totally smooth at that time. That reflects an outcome. That tells you. If you see something troublesome there, then that would tell you the opposite. That's how this works. So again, bottom line, this is what it is. And I'm sorry that I have to say, to the, I'm sure, great chagrin of all the Trumpers, and to hopefully the delight and the comfort of Democrats, Kamala Harris is going to be elected president November 5th, 2024. Plain and simple.